Today is June 8th. On this day in 1967, the state of Israel carried out a cold-blooded military strike against an American Navy vessel. It was called the USS Liberty. In 1967, Israel was in a regional geopolitical competition with Egypt, its southwestern neighbor. Claiming the need for preemptive self-defense, Israel launched an unprovoked attack against Egypt and then tried to draw the United States into the fight against Egypt on behalf of Israel. And the way that Israel accomplished this was by staging a false flag attack against the USS Liberty. Israeli fighters attacked the Liberty. They tried to sink it. They jammed its radio transmissions. They hit it with torpedoes. They even dropped napalm on the deck. And even as American sailors were trying to escape in escape rafts, these Israeli jets came in strafing and shooting the people trying to escape. The goal was to sink the ship and murder every one of the survivors so they could blame the attack on Egypt. And in fact, President Lyndon Johnson believed that Egypt was responsible for this attack, and he ordered an American airstrike against Cairo, which is the capital of Egypt. Fortunately, that attack was called off just 2 minutes before the jets reached Cairo, because Johnson learned through naval intelligence, that the attack was actually the work of Israel, not Egypt. But what made this incident so very dangerous is that just miles off the coast of Egypt were Soviet destroyers. The Soviet Union was allied with Egypt. Had this strike by America on Cairo actually taken place, the Soviets would undoubtedly have responded and attacked the U.S. Navy ships, which would have brought about World War III. So on the anniversary of that cunning and calculated attack, I am reposting an earlier video that I made on this subject. And the evidence presented in this video proves beyond any doubt that the state of Israel is an enemy of the American people and will use any means necessary, including bloody false flag attacks, to manipulate the United States into fighting Israel's enemies for them. Thank you for watching. It is my contention that the state of Israel is an enemy to the American people and to the security of the entire world. If after listening to today's episode you still think that Israel is somehow America's friend, well, there's simply no convincing you. I certainly respect everyone's right to form their own opinions and think what you want. But I think that if you listen to this episode of the End Times News Report with an open mind and with a willingness to double check anything that I say, any of these claims that you think might not be correct, so that you can verify it for yourself that what I'm saying is accurate, I believe you will come away understanding, as I do, that the continued close alliance of the United States government with the government of Israel is nothing short of a slap in the face of every man, woman, and child in America, and a clear and present danger to the security of our people. This week, in June 2017, marks the 50th anniversary of the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War that took place way back in 1967. Unknown to most Americans, in June of '67, the President of the United States, who at the time was Lyndon B. Johnson, he ordered a nuclear strike on Cairo, which is the capital of Egypt, but it was called off, fortunately, when the fighter jet carrying the nuclear weapons was just 2 minutes out from its target. Had that strike actually taken place, there probably would have been an immediate retaliation from Egypt's close ally, the Soviet Union, which had warships in the waters just off of Egypt's coastline. A retaliation which undoubtedly would have eventually turned into a global thermonuclear war. This incident was not an accident. It was part of a consciously planned and diabolical scheme. It was a scheme that was put into motion by the very entity that had just launched its own unprovoked war to grab Arab territory. I'm going to tell you about this story in detail of what took place that summer in 1967. At the center of the drama was an American vessel called the USS Liberty. June 14th of 1967, which, by the way, June 14th is Flag Day in the United States. The Liberty struggled into port. It had dozens of dead servicemen. 6 days earlier, back on June 8th, the State of Israel had launched an unprovoked, cold-blooded, and calculated attack against the USS Liberty, striking it with torpedoes and butchering not only the men that were on the Liberty's deck, but also the American sailors who were trying to evacuate their wounded in lifeboats. And even in times of war, you don't shoot the people in the lifeboats. Israel knew exactly what it was doing, though. It fully intended to sink the Liberty and kill every man who was a witness to what was going on. This was one of the greatest false flag attacks in modern history. It was a false flag because Israel intended to frame Egypt for the attack, with the hope that the United States would jump into the war with Israel against Egypt. Let there be no question whatsoever in your minds. This was no error on the part of Israel. They knew that they were attacking American sailors. And every single one of the survivors who made it through that barbaric onslaught by Israel says, without even a glimmer of uncertainty, that Israel knew that it was attacking a U.S. Navy vessel that was supposed to be an ally. If at the end of this episode you decide to accept Israel's story, that the attack was just an unfortunate misunderstanding, you are calling an entire ship full of highly trained, loyal American troops a bunch of liars. You, the viewers, can choose to stand with these American patriots who were eyewitnesses to the attack and know for themselves what happened, or you can choose to stand with the Rothschild Zionist regime of Israel, but you cannot stand with them both. One sailor said, "We were well known, and the attack was obviously deliberate. I consider it the cold-blooded murder of American sailors that day." Not only do the survivors of Israel's attack on the Liberty say that it was deliberate, but they say, and have said for the last 35 years, that the U.S. government has tried to silence them about what they knew. One sailor who was there during the attack said, "If it was an accident, it was the best planned accident I've ever heard of." So let's talk about the 6-Day War for just a moment. Most Americans today know almost nothing about the history of the modern state of Israel. You probably know that the capital of Israel today, claimed by Israel, is Jerusalem. But that wasn't always so. Up until 1967, Jerusalem was not the capital of Israel. It was Tel Aviv. In 1967, Israel conquered Jerusalem, and they took it. They took the land for themselves. This was then and remains today one of the greatest violations in the history of the United Nations. This illegal land grab by Israel has led to 35 years of extreme violence, constant fighting, great bloodshed. They handled it poorly. The war in 1967 propelled Israel forward to become the most powerful nation in the Middle East, but they didn't rise to power on their own. You know they couldn't do it. They were brand new in 1948. They got there with extensive help from the United States, which gave them all of this high-tech weaponry, the missiles, the aircraft, bombs, and tanks, billions of dollars in other kinds of financing as well. And without the financial backing of the Zionist-controlled Federal Reserve and their allies in the war industry, which we call the military-industrial complex, they never would have been able to win and hold Jerusalem. 1967 was a real turning point in the relationship of the USA to Israel. Richard Parker, who was the political consul in the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, Egypt, back in 1967, he said this, quote, "The security of Israel became one of our strategic priorities, which it had never been in the past." For the last 35 years, the men who were on the USS Liberty have been campaigning to spread the truth of what really happened. Let me talk with you about these men. Back in the 1960s, the draft was pulling young men into service to go to fight in Vietnam. People knew that if you waited until the draft got you, then you had no choice in choosing how you were going to serve. So most likely, if you got drafted, you were going to be one of the ones who has a gun stuck in your hands and dropped on the front lines. And back then, American boys were coming home by the thousands in body bags. So many people chose to enlist in the military voluntarily rather than risk getting drafted, because that way at least they had some choice in what they were going to do. The Navy was a pretty safe place to be during the Vietnam War, at least compared to the Army and the Marines who were fighting in the jungles. One of the enlistees was a man named John Rakowski. John explained that after getting 2 warnings that he was about to be drafted, he went ahead and joined the Navy. He went through a quick boot camp, and 13 weeks later, he was out there on the USS Liberty, nowhere near fighting in Vietnam. None of the men on the Liberty knew it, but even though they were, I don't want to say they were trying to avoid fighting in Vietnam, but let's be honest, that was part of it. None of them knew it, but they were getting ready to be involved in a very bloody war of their own. One thing that I've learned in studying military strategy over the decades is the best time to try to make major advancements is when your enemy is distracted. So while America was distracted with the Vietnam War, what was going on was America's archenemy, the Soviet Union. They were capitalizing on this by forming their own alliances in the Middle East. They were trying to spread, so they formed alliances with the governments of Egypt and Syria. And these are the 2 nations either to the south, southwest, and to the north of Israel. If America was going to try to gain strategic control of the Middle East by arming and backing Israel, the Soviets decided, well, we're going to try and contain the USA by backing Egypt and Syria. This is a big proxy war going on. So back during that time period, Egypt's president was Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was seen as the de facto leader of this alliance between the various Arab nations at the time. Nasser was no fan of America, especially since he had narrowly escaped an assassination plot by the American CIA. So when Israel started a series of unprovoked actions against Egypt's ally, Syria, President Nasser was under pressure from the Arab states to stand up to Israel. So now, while we've got that tension building, let's jump back to the Liberty. The USS Liberty had recently crossed the Atlantic to Abidjan, which is a port in West Africa. Some of the sailors went on shore leave. They took a few personal things with them, like movie cameras. And you can actually go online and watch some old movie footage, old clips of the sailors from the USS Liberty out on shore leave leading up to this attack. So the Liberty wasn't a combat ship, though. It was totally unarmed, and that's an important point. There were no weapons on it. The men aboard the ship were not what you typically think of when you think of military soldiers. These men never had much dirt or grease under their nails. They were sharp dressed. You see photos of them, sharp dressed in their sleek white Navy digs. They would frequently go up on deck and take their shirts off and sunbathe. On the Liberty, every Sunday afternoon, the crew held a barbecue. So I don't want to be insulting and say that it was a cushy job, but, it was. That's not to say that the USS Liberty didn't play a very important role. It did. It played a vital role because the vessel was designed as a spy ship to be able to listen into the radio transmissions and pass any important information on to the highest levels of the U.S. government. At the time, there was no other ship like it. It had a very unique appearance. You couldn't mistake the ship. When other soldiers and sailors, even outside of the U.S. military, when anyone saw this ship, they knew this is not a normal ship. There's something unique about it. On the deck of the ship, there was this huge 45 antennas along the deck. And below deck, there were dozens of men who spoke all kinds of languages. Because it was their job to listen into the radio transmissions that they were picking up and translate those messages into English. One of the analysts that was doing that was Joe Lentini. Joe explained that it didn't matter what frequency the transmissions were being made in, the Liberty could catch them. So this was very high tech for the time. Low frequencies, high frequencies, anything in between, the Liberty could pick it up. If they received any transmissions that were encoded in a way that they couldn't decipher, then they would send that transmission on to the NSA and let the NSA break the code with their computer programs. The NSA is the National Security Agency. That's America's top security organization. So you guys know who Edward Snowden is, right? He revealed the fact that the government is spying on us, right? checking out our emails, listening to our phone calls. Okay, he exposed the NSA. That's what the NSA does. So anyway, the USS Liberty was controlled by the NSA back in Washington, D.C. So we've got the stage set here with the Liberty. So let's jump back into Egypt. In May of that year, 1967, the Soviets conveyed to Egypt that Israel was prepping for a major attack on Syria, which it was. They wanted the Golan Heights. So President Nasser decided to begin preparing a counterattack, and he moved some troops into the Sinai Peninsula, which is Egyptian territory. So Israel moved down toward the peninsula in response to that, and the two sides engaged in some saber-rattling back and forth. But then Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, which is that cut off Israel's ability to send its ships from its southern port of Eilat around the Sinai Peninsula to attack Egypt. This was an action of self-defense. But what Nasser didn't know is that Israel had anticipated this. They had already prepared a propaganda message claiming that what Nasser did was an act of war that justified Israel in preemptively striking Egypt. You see, the Zionists love preemptive war. Have you picked up on that? Some people think that George W. Bush's preemptive strike against Iraq was something new. Indeed, it was as far as U.S. military history went, but it wasn't a new strategy to Bush's many neoconservative war advisors who, surprise, surprise, were all staunch Zionists. Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, these guys. Bush's American Zionists were simply taking a page out of the book written by the Israeli Zionists. The Zionists in government, whether we're talking about America or Israel, these guys are the war hawks. They're ever planning, always on the lookout for the next opportunity to help the military-industrial complex make a few $billion. So pause here and remember, at this point, Egypt had not done anything to Israel to merit an attack. Israel had already been flying into Syrian airspace. They've been taking shots at the Syrians. Israel was already building up its forces in preparation for a full-scale invasion of Syria. Egypt was simply responding to those provocations because they were allied with Syria. But this is what Israel does. They do something bad and expect everyone to be quiet about it. But when their opponents start to fight back or defend themselves, Israel pretends like they had nothing to do with this. They didn't provoke them. They didn't do anything. So at this point, Egypt had no reason to expect an attack from Israel based on their own actions. And that was Nasser's grave mistake. He failed to understand that these Zionists fight dirty. When it comes to war, nothing is off limits to Israel. Absolutely nothing. Remember that. By the time Nasser realized his mistake in judgment, though, it was too late. Let's go back to the Liberty. The ship's commander was a World War II veteran named William McGonigal. Really good guy. His crew included highly sophisticated code-breakers. The commanding officer is the guy who drove the ship. His assistant was the executive officer, or the XO. And the head of the ship's security was a research officer named Dave Lewis. Lewis explained that what the ship did was cruise around, somewhat leisurely, until there was some kind of international tension, and then the United States would send the Liberty into that area to monitor the various communications, which would then be sent back to the NSA, and they would evaluate if there was any intel that needed to be acted on. So a decision would then be made by the powers that be as to whether the situation warranted any kind of U.S. intervention. Because of the unique nature of this mission, the Liberty's mission, it frequently operated outside of the rest of the U.S. fleet. The ship would typically drift 10 miles along a coastline at about 3 knots. No hurry to get anywhere. That's not the point. The point is absorb the radio communications. The naval fleet commander left the exploits of the Liberty up to the ship commander, McGonigal, who was getting most of his orders from Washington, D.C. So McGonigal receives one of these orders just as the sailors are returning to their ship from that shore leave I was telling you about in West Africa. McGonigal orders his security officer, Dave Lewis, to quickly round up the remaining sailors because they need to get underway immediately. Their new destination was the Middle East, and they needed to double time it. Now, back in Washington at this time, Israel's secret intelligence chief, this guy was an infamous spy master. His name was Meir Amit. He was meeting secretly at the Pentagon with his counterparts in the CIA. He had also met with the Secretary of Defense, who at that time was Robert McNamara. And he asked McNamara what would America's position be if Israel struck the first blow against the Arab nations. So in 2002, that's in 67. In 2002, Meyer Amit was interviewed, and he revealed what he and McNamara discussed. Amit says that Israel's concern was that if Israel launched an unprovoked attack against the Arab allies of the Soviet Union, that the Soviets would respond and attack Israel. So Amit wanted assurance from McNamara that if Israel took this provocative action and it ticked off the Soviets and the Soviets attacked Israel, he wanted some assurance that the USA would jump into the ring to defend Israel. He also asked McNamara for a U.S. commitment to help Israel after the war as well. Amit says that McNamara asked him two questions. First one, how long would it take for Israel to accomplish its military goals? And Amit said it'd take about 1 week. McNamara's second question, how many casualties are we talking about? 10,000 or less. Meyer Amit says that McNamara thinks 10,000, 1 week. Green light. Go ahead. So Amit returns to Israel to report on America's position. And that very night, the NSA suddenly dispatched one of its own agents to join the USS Liberty, this guy named Alan Blue. All right, so there's a lot going on here. We are getting ready for war. The spy masters are working it out. Early on June 5th, in 1967, Israel launched the attack. It was completely unprovoked. Egypt was caught totally unprepared for it. And Israel's Air Force, they started out first by pounding Egypt's airfields in the Sinai Peninsula and in the Suez Canal zone, and they obliterated it. The Israeli Air Force wiped out the Egyptian Air Force very rapidly. Egypt never got more than a few of its planes off the ground. So reacting to Israel's strikes, the Soviets did respond. They responded by moving 20 Navy warships off the coast of Egypt, very close to this war zone. The Pentagon ordered the U.S. 6th Naval Fleet, though, to stay out of the way. They were about 100 miles off the coast. They did not, at this point, want to have any direct confrontation by playing chicken out there in the water with the Soviets. But nobody told this to the USS Liberty. For some reason, Washington wanted the Liberty to put itself right there off of Egypt's coast, right there with the Soviet ships steaming in. Liberty Security Chief Dave Lewis radioed the commander of the 6th Fleet and asked them to send a destroyer escort. Because remember, the Liberty had no weapons. They would be entering what was a war zone, and they would be doing it with no defenses. So the 6th Fleet commander says, sorry, but no. No escort for you. You're on your own, which was very unusual. But just wait, because this gets even fishier. I want to pause just for a second and make a quick mention of what Israel was doing here. This was a land grab. That's all it was, pure and simple. Just like Israel is still snatching land away today from other people and adding it to their own sovereign territory. Back in 1967, Israel was stealing lands from other nations. First, they stole the Gaza Strip. Then they stole the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Next, they stole the territory called the West Bank from their neighbor Jordan. And most controversially, Israel grabbed East Jerusalem from Jordan, including all of the holy Arab sites. Talk about ticking off the Arabs. Remember, up until this point, Jerusalem was not part of Israel. The capital of Israel was in Tel Aviv, but the Zionists wanted Jerusalem. They wanted all of it. And by the third day of the Six-Day War, they had gotten it. It was on this evening that the Liberty finally reached her destination there, pretty close to the Gaza Strip. They were off the Sinai coastline. So the next morning, Thursday, June 8th, began as a calm, clear day. Israel was keeping an eye on the Liberty. They sent out their Air Force 12 different times that morning to gather intel on the ship. 12 times. The crew members out there on the Liberty, they were happy that the Israeli warplanes kept coming by. That made them feel safe because remember, America is supposed to be allied with Israel. The Israelis were friends of America. The presence of these jets gave them some peace because of the Soviet ships were not that far away. So crew member Lloyd Painter, he recalls that after they did their morning duties, most of the officers were out on deck sunbathing. Pretty typical activity. The Israeli plane saw that the crew members were shirtless, they were unarmed. Obviously, the Liberty posed no threat whatsoever. Several of the guys were in lawn chairs on the deck, and others were laying on towels. Okay, 12 flyovers. The Israelis knew. That, plus the American flag, kind of gave it away. The Liberty was unmistakable. It had all of the normal U.S. naval vessel markings. It had that huge U.S. flag. Skies were bright and cloudless. Visibility was perfect. There was no way they could mistake it. Not only that, but U.S. intercept stations twice overheard Israeli pilots reporting that the ship was American. And you can even listen to some of this online, some of the audio of the Israeli pilots, along with the translation into English, radioing back and forth to the mainland, having this discussion about, yes, this is the Liberty, this is a U.S. vessel. So again, this gives the crewmen aboard the Liberty a sense of security. They had no idea what was getting ready to happen. But around 2 p.m. on June 8th, sailors on the deck of the Liberty noticed 3 Delta Wing Mirage jets approaching. And the sailors became nervous because they realized that unlike the other jets that were clearly Israeli planes that they had been seeing all day, these jets had no markings on them. There was nothing to identify these jets. They had been erased, painted over. Then the jets dropped lower, leveled off at attack attitude. Then the sailors start seeing these red flashes appearing under their wings. And in an instant, the USS Liberty starts taking hits from bullets and from missiles. The portholes of the ship were blown out instantly from the concussive force of the blast. All of the sailors were knocked to their feet. Immediately, the 1MC shipboard public address circuits came to life. General quarters, this is not a drill. General quarters, the ship is under attack. The airstrikes continued relentlessly. Israel shredded the decks. They blew up the Liberty's transmission towers. And an interesting side story is that one Israeli pilot disobeyed orders repeatedly to fire on the vessel. And he flew back to the base. And you know what they did? They arrested him. The Israeli MPs arrested him for refusing to fire on the American ship. Now this next part is significant. Absolute proof that Israel knew that the ship was a U.S. Navy vessel. When the Liberty tried to radio a distress signal, they found that their signals were being jammed. Joe Lentini, a survivor of the attack, he explained that the only way to jam a distress signal is if you first know what frequency that signal is being transmitted on. Ships could be identified by those frequencies. And the entire Sixth Fleet, well known to the Israeli government, the entire Sixth Fleet was operating on a certain frequency. So it was impossible for Israel to jam the signal without knowing that was an American frequency. Israel knew it was attacking an American vessel. Liberty Security Personnel Chief Dave Lewis, he said that after taking out the Liberty's towers, the jets began dropping napalm on the deck. Lewis explained the strategy. He said that these Israeli jets didn't want the Liberty sending out any communications about what was happening. And by dropping this highly flammable napalm onto the deck and setting it on fire, Israel was trying to stop the crew members from going up on deck to try and repair and reestablish communication signals. That's what the men were trying to do. So the Liberty, despite that, they still managed to get an SOS out. Lewis said that his men were so crazy that they ran out on deck to try and restring these wires, all while the Israeli jets are pounding them, taking heavy fire. But the men, even though this had been a cushy job, they did their duty. They got out there. So the jets keep attacking, leaves 8 sailors dead, 75 badly injured up until that point. But that's still not the worst. The worst was yet to come. There goes the 1MC again, blaring a new announcement. Incoming torpedo, starboard side. And below the waterline, down on the starboard side engine room, the men that were in there, they hear that message. They knew they were going to die. What happens when a torpedo hits the boiler room is that the cold water rushes in from the ocean. It starts a chain reaction that results in a massive explosion. It's like a small atomic bomb. So here you've got these 19-year-old boys, these are still teenagers, sitting there, holding their breath, saying prayers, steeling their nerves, getting ready to die. Seconds pass. The torpedo misses. They're still alive, but this same scenario happens 3 more times. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what those American boys had to have been thinking? Just the thought of it fills me with indignation toward the people who did this. Well, a torpedo finally hit. Fortunately, it missed the boiler, so the ship wasn't instantly obliterated. But still, when it struck, the explosion was so powerful that it lifted the ship all the way up out of the water. That's how strong this explosion was. It caused the bulkhead to wrap around a few of the other sailors, and that shielded them from the direct blast and saved some of their lives. But it was so hot that it instantly melted the paint off the walls, splattered it on the paint, splattered the paint onto the skin of the nearby sailors, including Dave Lewis. Well, of course, the burns were incredibly painful. Lewis lost both eardrums, burned his eyes, but he survived. He said that almost all the other troops who were within 20 feet of him were killed, though. These sailors. The ship began to list, and the sailors were afraid that it was going to flip upside down. It didn't, but the ship was paralyzed. They had lost power. Steering was gone. Ship was dead in the water. The only thing they had going for them was that SOS message that they had managed to get out. And they only got it out because of the selfless heroism of some of those sailors that went up on deck and faced that napalm attack. The SOS was picked up by the American Sixth Fleet, but they were 500 miles away. They were up near Crete. The fleet commander ordered immediate retaliation, because they weren't in on this. They didn't know the schemes that were going on. So on the USS America, 2 air bombers and a fighter jet escort were launched. Now, these weren't just any aircraft that were launched. The admiral had placed the fleet under Condition November. The bombers were carrying nukes, nuclear missiles. Their destination was the capital of Egypt. They were going to nuke Cairo. Now, you say, why would the U.S. attack Egypt instead of Israel? Well, remember, at this point, the USA did not know that the people on the Liberty were being attacked by Israel. Israel had removed all the identifying markings from the jets. Why would the Americans assume the jets were Israeli? It made no sense. Israel was our ally. The Liberty was off the coast of Egypt. The Egyptians were allied with our enemies, the Soviets. The attack on the Liberty had to be by the Egyptians. At least that's what Israel wanted America to think. And it almost happened. We almost nuked Cairo, which would have set off World War III. We were that close to a nuclear war a few years. This is just a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis was bad. We got close to nuclear war then, but not nearly as close as we were in 1967 when Israel attacked the United States. On the ground in Cairo, the U.S. Embassy was contacted. They were told that a U.S. retaliatory strike was coming. And remember this political consul I mentioned at the embassy, Richard Parker? Let me read a quote from him. This is what he said. There was this message that the Navy was preparing to retaliate for the attack on the Liberty. They thought it was the Egyptians who had attacked it and were going to respond. But the U.S. aircraft that was carrying the nukes, they were called back to the ship. Who called them back? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara himself. 2 minutes before the strike was to take place. Now, you've probably never heard of this, have you? This is why we are supposed to study history, people. Stop watching all that crap that's rotting your minds. Learn real history. The monsters who did this sit atop the power pyramid. They don't want us to know these things. If the entire American public knew just how close to nuclear annihilation we were, in 1967, do you think there might be a few citizens out there who were saying, you know what, maybe supporting all of these military campaigns around the world on behalf of Israel, maybe that's not in our best interests. Maybe the best thing to do would be to engage in disarmament. Try and find peaceful solutions to our problems. But no, the military-industrial complex can't make its money, can it? Not if our country is full of peaceniks, so the truth is suppressed. They don't want you to know this stuff. Now, an important question that we should ask here is this. How did McNamara know that Egypt wasn't responsible for the attack on the Liberty? Why did he call it off? Not even the Liberty at that point knew for certain that it was Israel. They hadn't had time to process this. Hold that thought. Here's another question. The Liberty was sinking. After being told to recall the nuclear-armed fighter jets, the commander of the 6th Naval Fleet launched a rescue mission. They sent jets armed only with conventional weapons this time to try and get out there and protect the Liberty from the ongoing attacks because they were still happening. After the fleet launched the fighters, Commander radioed McNamara to advise him of what they were doing. The Secretary of Defense ordered the Admiral to stand down and to immediately recall those jets. There was to be no rescue mission. First time in U.S. history that a rescue mission like this was sent out during an attack and was recalled. The Admiral argued this with McNamara. He told him that he was going to refuse to obey this order. He didn't care if he was the Secretary of Defense. America was under attack, and he was going to get out there and save those men unless he heard the stand-down order come from the Commander-in-Chief himself. And that is when President Lyndon B. Johnson revealed that he was actually already on the phone call. He just hadn't been speaking. He was listening in to what McNamara was saying. So, it's sickening. It's hard to believe. And here's what Johnson said, and this is a quote from someone who heard this. This is what Johnson said. I don't give a damn if the ship sinks. I will not embarrass our allies. That's what was said. So while this drama is going on between the 6th Fleet and Washington, you've got the Liberty still under attack by the Israeli torpedo boats. They've got the torpedo boats out there. They were continuing to try and blow up that boiler and sink the ship. They knew exactly what they were doing. So finally, Commander McGonigal gives the order to abandon ship. But to the horror of the crew, when they got up on deck, they found only a few lifeboats were still usable, and they were floating in the water behind the ship. Near the lifeboats was an Israeli torpedo boat strafing the American lifeboats with gunfire. They were getting rid of the lifeboats as well and the people that were trying to get into them. It was clear that Israel was there to make sure not only that that ship sank, but that no survivors made it back to tell the tale of what happened. Eventually, the attack came to an end when it became clear that the torpedo boats were not going to be able to sink the Liberty. As soon as they left the scene, the government of Israel contacted U.S. officials to report that they had accidentally fired on an American ship. They spent over an hour blasting them, and that was after half a day's worth of flights overhead to verify that these were Americans. It was an accident. The first official to get the word was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. His name was Lucius Battle. Pretty cool name. Here's a direct quote from Battle. He said, quote, "When I heard Israel's story, my immediate reaction was that it was impossible that this was an accident. I talked with President Johnson, and he agreed with me that it had been no intentional attack. That it had to be an intentional attack. Everybody was appalled at the Israelis. Johnson knew that this attack was deliberate. You can find an online copy of the minutes recorded in an emergency White House meeting in which Johnson said that it was, quote, I read this myself, quote, inconceivable that it was accidental." Johnson was ticked off. He would not stand up to Israel, though. The CIA director back in 1967 was Richard Helms. Here's what he had to say, quote, I know that for the first 24 hours, the president was furious that something like this had gone on without him knowing. Johnson was the president of the United States and wasn't told about this operation in advance. But despite Johnson's obvious belief that Israel was lying, he ordered his people to publicly accept and agree with Israel's story that the attack was an honest mistake. Helms went on to explain that the way the power structure was in Washington, the establishment would go after Johnson if he had spoken out against Israel. They would have crucified him. Helms said that, quote, various people got at him, meaning Johnson. So Johnson bent to Israel's will, accepted their apology publicly on behalf of the entire nation. But Johnson knew it. And the record proves it. Pause here and chew on that for a second. The President of the United States knew that the government of Israel engaged in an act of war with full knowledge of what they were doing. They massacred members of our own military, and our president did nothing. Why? I don't want to get into that in this video for the sake of time, but you have to understand that there is power that is greater than our president, a power that is greater than our U.S. Congress that controls our country. And you don't mess around with those people unless you are willing to risk your life. Just like this shadow government did not tell Johnson the details of what Israel was going to do, I don't personally believe that the shadow government truly informed George W. Bush of everything that they were going to be doing on 9/11. I think that he knew the attack was coming. I don't think that he was privy to all of the details. I'm not absolving Johnson. I'm not absolving Bush. They may not have known all the details, but they were certainly a party to the overall plans of these New World Order psychopaths. Do you really think that Bush Jr. was smart enough on his own to come up with 9/11 and plan this all out? Come on. He might be charismatic, but he was a bumbling idiot. He was a useful dupe that could be manipulated by the true powers, the Illuminati, Zionists, and their lackeys. In 1997, at Arlington Cemetery, the captain of the USS, and you can find this video online, I'd recommend you look for it. Captain of the USS Liberty, the commander, William McGonigal, he broke his silence. Here's what he said, quote, I watched this speech. He said, for many years, I have wanted to believe that the attack on the Liberty was pure error. It appears to me that it was part of a pure case, that it appeared to me that it would be a pure case of mistaken identity. But I think it's about time that the state of Israel and the U.S. government provide the crew of the Liberty and the rest of the people the facts of what happened and why the Liberty was attacked. And McGonigal's good friend, the former chief engineer of the Liberty, George Golden, he told the BBC this, quote, Israel's plan was to sink our ship and kill every one of us so they could blame it on Egypt and get America into the war. And I agree with him. The sinking of the Lusitania is what got the U.S. into World War I. That was a false flag attack. President Woodrow Wilson was fully aware of the scam. Roosevelt knew in advance about the coming attack on Pearl Harbor. He did nothing to stop it so that America would have an excuse to enter World War II. President Johnson knew full well that the Vietnamese had not tried to torpedo our naval vessel in the Gulf of Tonkin. Yet he used that lie to get into Vietnam. Then we've got Bush Sr., who lied to get us into the Gulf War. He even mentioned the need to go to war to help build a new world order. And his son took America back to war with Iraq years later, using 9/11 as a justification. By the way, Israel was responsible for that attack as well. My fellow Americans, you need to learn history. It keeps repeating itself over and over again. Almost every war we've ever been in has been initiated by these kinds of false flag attacks, and the Israeli Six-Day War was no exception. The false flag attack on the Liberty almost started World War III. On June 8th, 1967, 34 crewmen aboard the USS Liberty were killed by the State of Israel, and another 171 men were severely injured. The survivors of the attack are undeniably united in the certainty that the attack was not a mistake. Since 1967, one question has haunted them. It's the same question that I'm sure you are asking as well. Why? Why did Israel attack the USS Liberty? To answer that, you have to first understand the agenda of the people who control the governments of Israel and the United States. They want nothing short of complete world domination. These conspirators have no allegiance to any particular country, which is why we call them globalists. Part of the plans of these globalists is to rule and reign over every man, every woman, every child on the face of our planet. But there are simply too many people on planet Earth for them to achieve their goals. And that is why massive human depopulation is a fundamental aspect of the New World Order agenda. The goal of these globalists, from their own mouths, is to reduce the world's population by 99%, from over 7 billion down to only 500,000 people. Or maybe it's 500 million people. This figure is etched in stone, literally. You can look up Georgia Guidestones. The globalists are using all kinds of techniques to reduce the population. They're killing the human sperm count through these global vaccination programs. They're making the population sick through chemtrailing. They're manufacturing and releasing plagues such as Ebola that threaten to wipe out a third of the population of the planet if it ever gets fully out of control. But the surest and fastest way to reduce populations is still through the age-old practice of war. The Illuminati globalists used Israel to try to provoke America into attacking Egypt, which would have inevitably resulted in World War III with hundreds of millions of people who could have died in a nuclear holocaust. We were saved from that holocaust in 1967 with less than 2 minutes to spare. And here we are again, watching the Illuminati use its puppet, the State of Israel, to steal lands, provoke other nations into war. Here we are again, with the USA firmly backing Israel while nuclear Russia is standing behind Israel's Arab enemies like Syria. How close are we going to get to war this time? We keep getting awfully close. Backs off, then it comes to the brink again. I'm doing the best I can by myself by making these videos to try and alert people and wake people up, but it isn't enough. I'm asking you to do your part. And if you don't know anything else to do, then at least help me spread this message. Subscribe to my channel, spread this video, share it. Help me break this blacklist algorithm that YouTube has me locked in. Help me get the word out before it's too late. That's all for today. I just thought that the heroes from the USS Liberty deserve to have their story told on this, the 50th anniversary of the attack on the USS Liberty. Thank you so much for watching. For the End Times News Report, I'm Jake Morphonios.